The emergency room went silent the moment Dr. Marcus Holt pointed his finger at her. This nurse killed my patient. 37 staff members heard it. 17 of them watched as Nurse Lena Hart was stripped of her badge, her access card deactivated in real time, her locker emptied by hospital security while her hands were still shaking from trying to save a man's life. She didn't scream. She didn't cry in front of them. She picked up her bag and walked out through the sliding glass doors of Hartwell General Hospital in Raleigh, North Carolina. And nobody stopped her. Nobody knew that the woman they just threw away had once carried wounded soldiers out of a burning forward operating base with nothing but her bare hands and a trauma kit held together with duct tape. Nobody knew the dog that would arrive 6 hours later already knew her scent. If this story has you leaning forward already, follow my channel, hit like, and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The morning had started the way most bad days do, quietly, without warning, disguised as something ordinary. Lena Hart arrived at Hartwell General at 6:45, 15 minutes before her shift began. She always came early, not because anyone asked her to, not because she was angling for recognition from supervisors who barely remembered her name. She came early because the ER at 6:45 was the one version of itself that made sense. Machines beeping in calm rhythm, the overnight team finishing their handoff notes, the smell of coffee cutting through the antiseptic air. Lena needed that 10 minutes of controlled quiet before the chaos arrived with the morning. But she was 28 years old, 5'6", with dark hair pulled back tight and a face that people consistently described as hard to read. Her coworkers liked her well enough, the way people like furniture that never gets in the way. She did her job, she didn't complain, she didn't socialize much during breaks, and she left when her shift ended. Nobody at Hartwell General had ever thought of Lena Hart as someone exceptional. Nobody had tried. That suited her fine. She hung her jacket in her locker, checked her secondary stethoscope was clipped where she kept it, and pulled up the overnight notes on the ward tablet. 3 pending discharges, 1 post-op transfer from cardiology, and a 44-year-old male, Thomas Viard, admitted 2 nights ago with acute respiratory distress, now listed as stable but requiring monitoring. Viard. She'd been tracking his file since his second day in. Something about the progression hadn't sat right with her. His oxygenation metrics kept dipping below the threshold they should have cleared by now, and the medication dosage listed in his chart, adjusted 48 hours ago by Dr. Marcus Holt personally, struck her as aggressive. Not wrong in a way she could point to in a single sentence. Wrong the way a sound is wrong when you've heard engines fail before and you recognize the frequency. She made a note to check on him at 7:15. She never got the chance. At 7:03, a ward alarm pulled the overnight nurse out of Viard's room at a run. Lena was closer. She was already moving before the second alarm triggered, pushing through the door to room 114 to find Thomas Viard in full respiratory failure, oxygen saturation crashing, his lips gone the kind of blue that means you have a very short window before the situation becomes unrecoverable. She called the code herself. She started the airway protocol before the crash cart arrived. By the time the on-call resident came through the door, Lena had already repositioned the patient, was bagging him manually, and had identified that the secondary IV line had been running at the wrong rate. Someone had adjusted the drip and not logged it correctly. They worked on Viard for 19 minutes. He didn't make it. Lena stood in room 114 afterward, her hands still gloved, the crash cart pushed to one side and the silence of a room where someone just died pressing in from all angles. She wasn't the only one standing there. The resident, 2 other nurses, a respiratory tech. But she was the one who noticed the medication log in the tablet on the wall, showing an administration entry at 5:47 a.m. that didn't match any of the nursing handoff records. Someone had entered a dosage adjustment under the overnight shift, but the overnight nurse's account showed no such entry had been made from her station. Lena photographed the screen with her personal phone. She didn't fully understand yet why that instinct fired. She just knew that when something doesn't match, you document it before someone makes it match. Dr. Marcus Holt arrived on the floor at 7:41. Lena had met him in passing over the 2 years she'd worked at Hartwell General. He was 47, chief of general surgery, and carried himself the way men do when they've been successful long enough that other people's discomfort has stopped registering as relevant information. He was not a bad surgeon by reputation, but reputation and reality occupied different floors in hospitals like this one, and Lena had observed enough to understand that Holt's reputation was maintained with a great deal of careful effort. He came into room 114, reviewed the chart for less than 2 minutes, spoke with the resident in a low voice Lena could not fully hear from the doorway, and then turned. He looked at her the way someone looks at a problem they've already decided how to solve. "You were first on scene," he said. "Yes," Lena said. "I called the code at 7:04. "And the IV rate," he said. "You noticed the IV rate." "After I established the airway. His saturation was—" "The administration entry," Holt said, cutting her off cleanly. "The 7:04 adjustment. That came from your login." Lena went still. "No," she said. "It didn't." Holt looked at her for a moment in a way that told her he had already decided what had happened, and her version of it was an inconvenience he was prepared to manage. "The entry is flagged to your credentials. The system shows your badge was scanned at this station at 0540. "I wasn't here at 5:40, Lena said. Her voice was level. She'd used that voice in conditions where being anything other than level would have gotten people killed, and it came easily. "I arrived at 6:45. You can check the entry gate log." "I intend to check everything," Holt said. "Not like a promise, like a warning. In the meantime, per hospital protocol, I'm placing you on investigative suspension pending review." "That entry is falsified," Lena said. "The overnight nurse is not under review." Holt held her gaze for a second and then looked past her. "Security will escort you to collect your things." But there were 31 people in the hallway when Lena walked out. She would think about that number later. 31 colleagues, people she'd handed supply kits to, people she'd covered extra shifts for, people she'd stood next to in triage bays at 2 in the morning. Most of them looked away. A few watched with the careful blankness of people who were waiting to see how this would resolve before they chose a position. None of them said anything. The security officer, young, clearly uncomfortable, doing his job, walked beside her to the locker bay. She opened her locker. She took her jacket, her spare stethoscope, the small framed photo she kept on the upper shelf. She did not take the photo down the way someone in shock takes things down. She took it down the way you pack before a long mission. Deliberate, efficient, nothing wasted. "Ma'am," the officer said quietly, "I'm sorry." "You're doing your job," she said. She wasn't dismissing him. She meant it. She handed over her badge at the security desk. The access card. She signed the form they pushed across the counter. And then she walked out through the sliding glass doors into the February morning. Cold, overcast, the kind of sky that gives you nothing. And stood on the sidewalk outside Hartwell General Hospital with her bag over her shoulder and her jaw tight. She did not fall apart on that sidewalk. She thought about it, the way you acknowledge a door and don't walk through it. Then she put her earbuds in, pulled up her weather app, and figured out the bus route home. On the bus, she pulled out her phone and looked at the photograph she'd taken of the medication log in room 114. The timestamp, the dosage adjustment, the credential marker in the top right corner, a small alphanumeric code that told any trained reader which staff account had generated the entry. She'd spent enough time in systems where documentation errors got people killed to recognize immediately that this code was wrong. Not wrong in the sense of a mistake. Wrong in the sense of constructed. Someone had put her credentials on that entry, which meant someone had planned for Thomas Veard to die on her shift. She stared at the photograph for a long time while Raleigh moved past the bus windows in gray February light. Then she put her phone away. She wasn't sure yet what she was going to do about it, but she knew she wasn't going to do nothing. Her apartment was on the 4th floor of a building on Grayson Street, a 2-bedroom she'd rented for the past 18 months because it had good light and a secure entrance, and she'd never bothered to redecorate past the stage of functional. Books on the shelves, a kitchen that was clean, a closet that held, behind the civilian clothes, a small fireproof lockbox she hadn't opened in 14 months. She made coffee. She sat at the kitchen table with her laptop and opened the hospital's staff portal, still active because the suspension was investigative and they hadn't pulled her full access yet. She pulled up Thomas Veard's file, or tried to. The file had been locked, elevated access only. In the time between her leaving the hospital and arriving home, roughly 45 minutes, someone had restricted access to Veard's record. That was not a standard procedure for an investigative suspension of a floor nurse. That was someone protecting something. Lena closed the laptop. She sat with her coffee for a while. The apartment was quiet. Outside, a car alarm went off briefly and then stopped. She thought about calling someone, a hospital union rep, an attorney, a former colleague who might have access to the system through a different credential level. She thought about each of those options and what they would set in motion and how fast things would move once she made noise. She thought about Thomas Veard's blue lips and the drip line running wrong and the look on Holt's face when he told her the entry was logged to her credentials. Not surprised, not disturbed, prepared. She thought about the last time she'd been in a situation where someone with more institutional power than her had decided what the truth was going to be. She opened the lockbox. Inside, a folded set of discharge papers from the U.S. Army, a challenge coin from the 68th Medical Brigade, 2 citations she'd never framed, a laminated ID card from her time attached to a forward surgical team operating in conditions that were still partially classified, and a photograph, worn at the corners, creased down the center, of herself and a German shepherd sitting in the dirt outside a concrete structure somewhere that looked like nowhere, both of them squinting against desert sun. The dog in the photograph was named Boone. She hadn't seen Boone in 14 months. She put the photograph on the table next to her coffee cup, sat back, and thought for a long time. What? The call came at 4:17 that afternoon. She'd expected it to be the hospital's legal department, or maybe the nursing board, if Holt had already moved things that fast. She was prepared for either. She was not prepared for the number that appeared on her screen, a 910 area code, a number she hadn't seen active in over a year. She answered it. Hart. The voice was dry, direct, and entirely familiar. Calloway, she said. Master Sergeant Vincent Calloway, U.S. Army, currently assigned to a unit she was not going to name out loud on a civilian phone line. She'd last spoken to him at her discharge debrief. He'd shaken her hand, told her she was one of the best combat medical personnel he'd worked with in 20 years, and then they'd both pretended neither of them was bothered by the fact that she was leaving. I heard you had a rough morning, Calloway said. Lena looked at the ceiling. News travels. I have a contact at the VA Medical Oversight Board who flagged something at Hartwell General about 4 hours ago. I'm not going to get into the full picture over the phone, but I need to ask you something. Ask? The patient, Veard, Thomas Veard, admitted 2 days ago. You know who he was? Lena frowned. 44-year-old male. Construction, per the intake form. Respiratory distress. Why? A pause. He was a government contractor. Specifically, he was under protected status related to a federal deposition he was scheduled to give in 11 days. The kitchen got very quiet. His death, Lena said slowly, removes him from that deposition. It removes his testimony, Calloway said. And if a nurse's falsified credential gets attached to the cause of death error, it also creates a very convenient explanation that ends all further inquiry. Someone at that hospital knew who he was, Lena said. It wasn't a question. We think it goes higher than a single doctor, Calloway said. What I need to know is whether you have anything you pulled before they locked the file. Lena looked at her phone, at the photograph she'd taken in room 114 at 7:06 that morning. Yeah, she said. I have something. Don't send it digitally, Calloway said. I'm going to have someone come to you. When? Tonight, he said. Maybe sooner. And Lena... He stopped, which was unusual. Calloway didn't stop mid-sentence. Be careful about who you open the door for until then. I'm not being dramatic. The line ended. Lena set the phone down on the table next to the photograph of herself and Boone. She looked at them both for a moment. Then she stood up, checked the deadbolt on the front door, and moved to the window to look down at Grayson Street. A blue sedan she didn't recognize was parked across the street. It had been there when she'd gotten home. She wasn't sure it had been there before today. She let the curtain fall back into place. In her old life, the life before Hartwell General, before stethoscopes and shift schedules and colleagues who looked away, she had been trained to read environments, to notice what was present that shouldn't be and what was absent that should. She had been trained to make decisions quickly and accurately when the cost of being wrong was measured in human lives. She pulled her bag off the kitchen chair and began moving through the apartment in the practiced, unhurried way of someone who had prepared for bad situations before they arrived. Phone charger, external drive. The medication log photograph already saved to 2 locations, a change of clothes. The challenge coin. She didn't know why, she never did, but it always went with her. She was almost done when she heard it. A sound from the building's interior hallway. Not a neighbor. She knew her neighbor's sounds, footsteps, door rhythms, the particular way the elevator settled on her floor. This was different. This was someone standing still, trying to decide something. Lena stood in the center of her kitchen with her bag in her hand and waited. The knock, when it came, was not at her door. It was at the building's service entrance at the end of the hall. 3 knocks, a pause, 2 more. A pattern she hadn't heard in over a year but had never forgotten. She crossed to her front door, looked through the peephole at an empty hallway, opened it, and moved to the service entrance. She opened it. The hallway light caught the face of Sergeant First Class Diana Reyes, 32, compact, dark-eyed, currently in civilian clothes that couldn't quite conceal the bearing underneath, and at her side, a German shepherd with a military working dog vest that had been unbuckled and folded back, probably to be less conspicuous in a civilian building. The dog looked up at Lena. Then he stepped forward, pressed his nose once against her hand, and sat. Lena looked at Boone. Boone looked back at her. "He found your apartment in under 3 minutes," Reyes said quietly. "We parked 2 blocks away, and he pulled straight to your building. I thought you should know that." Lena crouched and put her hand on Boone's head. He leaned into it with the serious, grounded weight of a dog who has never in his life been uncertain about anything. "There are people watching the building," Reyes said. 2 vehicles. We came through the adjacent property's service access." "I know," Lena said. She stood. "How bad is it?" Reyes met her eyes. "Calloway sent me because of what we found in the last 6 hours. The file on Viard goes back 14 months, Lena. This isn't just a medication error. What happened in that room today was the end of something that started a long time ago, and the people who started it are currently very motivated to make sure you are the official explanation." Lena looked at Boone once more. He was watching the hallway in both directions with the calm, total attention of an animal that has been trained to protect things worth protecting. "What do we need?" she asked. "The photograph," Reyes said, "and whatever else you pulled. And we need to move." Lena shouldered her bag. "Then let's move," she said. She didn't look back at the apartment. She didn't let herself think about the normalcy she'd built here over 18 months. The early mornings, the controlled quiet, the life she'd tried to make out of something ordinary. She moved through the service entrance with Reyes, Boone falling in at her left side without being told, and as the door closed behind them, she heard the blue sedan's engine start on the street below. They were already gone. The service stairwell smelled like concrete and old pipe insulation, and Lena took the steps 2 at a time with Boone moving silently beside her, his nails making almost no sound on the painted metal. Reyes was ahead, phone face down in her left hand, checking corners before she committed to them. She moved the way people move when the habit has been worn in deep enough that it doesn't look like caution anymore. It just looks like how they walk. They came out through a ground floor utility exit into the narrow alley between Lena's building and the dry cleaner next door. Cold air. The smell of a dumpster. A sliver of Grayson Street visible at the alley's mouth. And at that sliver, the front quarter panel of the blue sedan, still idling. Reyes pressed flat against the building wall, pulled Lena in beside her, and leaned to look. "Second vehicle," she said quietly. "Gray pickup, north end. They've got the street bracketed." "How many in each?" "2 in the sedan. The pickup I only confirmed 1, but that doesn't mean 1. Lena looked at Boone. He was facing the alley mouth, ears forward, not alarmed, alert. There was a difference, and she knew it well enough to trust it. If there had been someone in the alley ahead of them, he'd have told her. "There's a cut-through behind the dry cleaner," she said. "Leads to the parking structure on Morrow. Comes out on the 2nd level." Reyes glanced at her. "You memorized the neighborhood." "I memorized the exits," Lena said. "Different thing." They moved. The cut-through was barely wide enough for 2 people, and Boone navigated it without being told, tucking in tight behind Lena. At the far end, a chain-link gate that was supposed to be locked had been propped open with a broken brick, The dry cleaner's delivery guys, probably, taking the shortcut to the parking structure the same way Lena had scouted it. Some problems solved themselves. They came up through the parking structure's stairwell onto the second level, which was half empty, fluorescent lit, smelling of exhaust and cold rubber. A silver SUV with government plates sat 2 rows in from the stairwell, engine off but recently warm. She could feel the heat coming off the hood when they passed it. Reyes popped the rear door. "Get in." Lena got in. Boone jumped up without being invited and arranged himself across the back seat beside her with the casual authority of a dog who has been in many vehicles in many situations and has never found a single one of them surprising. The driver was someone Lena didn't recognize. Young, male, ears like a guy who's worn comms gear long enough that the indentation is permanent. He didn't introduce himself. He pulled out of the space before Reyes had fully closed her door, took the parking structure's exit ramp in a measured left-hand turn that avoided the street where the sedan was parked, and merged onto Morrow Avenue heading north. Nobody spoke for 2 blocks. Then Reyes said, "Callaway has a secure location on the east side, 20 minutes. "Tell me about the 14 months, Lena said. Reyes turned in the front seat to look at her. In the passing streetlight, she looked tired. Not from tonight, but from longer than tonight. The kind of tired that sits behind the eyes. Viard was a logistics coordinator for a federal infrastructure project running out of 3 states, Carolinas and Virginia. 8 months ago, he started noticing irregularities in materials contracts, falsified delivery manifests, invoices for equipment that was never installed, money moving through subcontractors in a pattern that didn't match any legitimate bid structure. He was going to testify about contract fraud, Lena said. Fraud is the smaller piece, Reyes said. The materials that were invoiced but never delivered. Some of them were safety-critical components, structural support elements for a series of municipal projects. Bridges. A water treatment expansion. Things where the difference between what was paid for and what was actually installed matters a lot if you're the person standing on one of those bridges. Lena let that sit for a moment. And Hartwell General, she said. What's the connection? Dr. Marcus Holt sits on the board of 2 of the subcontracting companies. Reyes said it the way you say something you've been waiting to say. His brother-in-law runs the primary contractor. Holt isn't just a surgeon with a liability problem. He's a stakeholder. Viard's testimony would have pulled a thread that led directly to him. The SUV turned east. The city thinned out around them. Fewer lit storefronts, more industrial buildings with dark windows, the kind of neighborhood that doesn't generate much foot traffic after dark. The credential forgery, Lena said. Someone accessed the hospital's staff system and generated an entry under my login. That's not something Holt does from his office. He had help inside the system. IT administrator named Prescott, Reyes said. He's been flagged in the federal investigation for 3 weeks. We didn't have enough to move on him until today. Until I handed you the photograph. Until you handed us the timestamp, Reyes said. The entry in Viard's chart was generated 4 minutes before the ward alarm triggered. You were on a bus heading home at that point. The gate logs confirm your departure. The digital trail they built against you has a hole in it, a small one, but it's there, and Prescott made it because he was in a hurry, and he didn't expect anyone to pull the raw log data before the file got locked. But they locked it fast, Lena said. Fast enough that anyone without the original screenshot would have nothing, Reyes confirmed. Lena looked at her phone. The photograph she'd taken in room 114, impulsive, instinctive, the result of a reflex she hadn't even consciously activated, was the thing holding all of this together right now. 6 hours ago, she'd been a nurse running a code on a man she was trying to save. Now she was in a government vehicle on the east side of Raleigh with her former military working dog pressed against her left arm and evidence of a federal cover-up on her phone. She thought about Thomas Viard, about what his last 2 days must have looked like. Admitted to a hospital, presumably thinking he was being treated for something real, not knowing that the place was being used to remove him from a timeline. She pressed her jaw tight and looked out the window. Tut. The secure location was a field office that didn't advertise itself. A former insurance company storefront on a side street, the signage removed, the windows covered with translucent film that let in light without letting anyone see in. Inside, folding tables, a bank of monitors, two people Lena didn't know running quiet on laptops, and standing in the center of the room with a paper coffee cup in one hand and the particular expression of a man who has been awake for 30 hours and is running on conviction alone. Master Sergeant Vincent Calloway. He looked at her when she came through the door. "You look terrible," he said. "You look worse," she said. He almost smiled. Almost. "Boone behave himself?" "Boone's always perfect," Lena said. "It's everyone else." Calloway set down his coffee and crossed his arms. He was 51, built like a man who used to be larger, and had whittled down to what was strictly necessary. He'd spent 23 years doing things the Army didn't put on press releases, and he wore that history the way structural beams wear load. You couldn't see the weight, but everything about him said it was there. "Sit," he said. "Both of you. I need to walk you through where we are." They sat at the nearest folding table. Boone settled on the floor at Lena's feet, chin on his forepaws. Calloway pulled up a digital file on the monitor to his left. A network diagram, names and companies connected by lines that branched and converged in a pattern that looked, from a distance, like a web. "Holt is here," he said, pointing to a node near the center. "He's not the top of this, but he's the piece that makes the cover-up medical. Without him, Veard goes to a regular hospital and either survives or he doesn't. But there's no credential forgery, no manipulated chart. Holt's the mechanism." "Who's above him?" Lena asked. Calloway pointed to two names at the upper level of the diagram. A state procurement official and a private equity partner who co-owns the primary contracting firm. We've been building toward them for 4 months. Veard's testimony was going to be the deposition that gave us enough to move. "And now Veard is dead," Lena said, "which is why we need the evidence you pulled and why we need it authenticated fast." Calloway looked at her directly. "Lena, I want to be straight with you. You are currently the named suspect in an incident that Holt's legal team is already building into a negligence case. By morning, the hospital's official position will be that you made a medication error that killed a patient, and that the error was the result of fatigue or incompetence or whatever story plays best. Your suspension will become a termination. The nursing board will receive a formal complaint." Lena listened to this without moving. "But," Calloway said. "But," she said, "the photograph you took is time-stamped. The metadata includes your phone's location data, which puts you at that tablet at 7:06, 3 minutes after the code was called, not before. The fabricated entry is time-stamped at 05:47. The building's entry gate logs show your badge scan at 06:44. The window they tried to put you in doesn't exist." He paused. "You documented the thing they needed you not to have documented." She hadn't thought of it that way. She'd just taken the photo. She'd seen something wrong, and her hands had moved before her brain had finished forming the sentence. "What do you need from me?" she said. "Your phone for evidence preservation, a formal statement tonight, and..." Calloway pulled a printed page from the table and pushed it toward her. "Authorization to include your medical observations of Veard's condition in the federal record. You were the first clinician on scene with clear eyes. What you saw in that room before and during the code may be the most accurate account of his actual treatment that we're going to get." Lena picked up the page. It was a consent form. Federal case reference number at the top. The kind of paperwork that meant what happened tonight was going into an official file that would outlast this room in this city and probably several careers. She read it once, carefully, the way she'd been trained to read anything before signing it. Then she signed it. She gave her statement to a federal investigator named Ochoa, 30s, methodical, the kind of listener who writes 3 words and somehow captures the whole thing. It took 90 minutes. She walked through every detail from the time she arrived on shift to the moment Reyes knocked on the service entrance. Ochoa asked clarifying questions that told her he already knew a great deal about what had happened, which meant the investigation had been moving on parallel tracks, and tonight was a convergence, not a beginning. When they were done, she sat alone at the folding table for a few minutes while the room moved around her. Calloway was on the phone. Reyes was at a monitor with one of the analysts. Boone had relocated from the floor to the folding chair beside Lena, which he was not supposed to do and which nobody said anything about. She put her hand on his back and felt him breathe. She was tired in the specific way that comes not from lack of sleep, but from having operated at a sustained level of alertness for too many consecutive hours. Her body wanted to stand down. Her mind wasn't ready to let it, because the part of her that had spent years in environments where standing down at the wrong moment was how people got hurt was still running its background check on everything in the room. Her phone buzzed on the table. She looked at it. Unknown number. Local area code. She answered it. Silence. Then, Ms. Hart. A voice she didn't recognize. Male, measured, with the practiced calm of someone who has made uncomfortable calls before. I'm calling on behalf of Dr. Holt. We think there may have been a misunderstanding today, and we'd like to discuss a resolution before this becomes more complicated for everyone involved. She looked at Calloway across the room. He was watching her, which meant he'd seen her face change. I'm listening, she said. We'd like to offer you a settlement. Full reinstatement of your nursing license, a signed agreement clearing any hospital liability record on your part, and a financial package. A pause. In exchange for the photographs taken at the hospital this morning and any copies. Lena kept her voice completely neutral. How do you know about photographs? A beat, longer than it should have been. Dr. Holt's team has reviewed the ward's security footage and observed you using your personal device in the treatment room. It's standard. The treatment room security camera, Lena said, covers the patient bed and the crash cart. It doesn't cover the wall-mounted tablet. She said it without inflection, which means your information about the photographs didn't come from the security footage. Another pause. This one had texture to it. Ms. Hart, Prescott told him, she said. She hung up. Calloway was beside her in 4 steps. What was that? They know I have the photograph, she said. Prescott told Holt, which means Prescott is still in contact with Holt, which means Prescott knows we have Prescott's name, Calloway said, already turning. If he tips Holt to start moving files, he already knows you're looking, Lena said. That call wasn't an offer. It was a test to find out how much I'd given you. Calloway stopped, looked at her. They're burning the records, she said. Tonight, before you can subpoena them. She watched him process it, watched the calculation happen in real time, the way she'd watched him make decisions in the field when the situation changed, and the plan became obsolete, and you had 3 seconds to build a new one. He turned to the room. We need a lockdown on Holt's hospital access. Right now. Server freeze on the Hartwell medical records system. Reyes was already on the phone. Lena stood. Boone stood with her. There's a secondary records cache, she said. Hartwell has an off-site backup system. It's a third-party medical records vendor, not hospital-controlled. If the main system gets wiped, the backup should hold the original, unaltered entries. Calloway looked at her. How do you know about the backup system? Because 6 months ago, I noticed the backup vendor's logo on the IT department's door and looked them up, she said. I was bored during a night shift. I didn't know it would matter. It matters, he said. I know the vendor's name, she said. If your people can get a federal hold on that account in the next... She checked the clock on the wall. Before their overnight maintenance window runs at 2 a.m., the original records are preserved regardless of what Holt does to the hospital system. Calloway was already relaying it across the room. Lena sat back down. Her hands, she noticed, were not shaking. They'd stopped doing that a long time ago in situations like this. Somewhere between her second and third deployment, when the shaking had become a luxury she couldn't afford, and her nervous system had simply reorganized itself around that fact. What she felt instead was a cold, clear, very specific kind of attention, the kind that narrows everything down to what matters and drops the rest. It was, she thought, and not with any pleasure, a feeling she recognized. She'd felt it in that hospital room this morning, standing over Thomas Veard with her hands in gloves, reading the room and knowing something was wrong before she could name it. She'd felt it on buses and in operating tents and in the back of vehicles moving fast through the dark. She'd spent 18 months trying to build a life that didn't require this feeling. The feeling had been waiting. From across the room, one of the analysts said, "The federal hold went through. Backup vendor is locked," but a pause. The particular kind of pause that precedes bad news. The hospital's internal system. Someone initiated a deletion protocol 11 minutes ago. We stopped most of it, but there are 3 files in Veard's record that are showing as corrupted. We may not recover them. Calloway looked at Lena. She thought about what had been in those files. The original medication orders, the nursing assessments from the first 48 hours. The intake documentation that would have shown what Viard's condition actually looked like when he arrived. The overnight nurse, Lena said. Her name is Dara Shields. She was on the floor the 2 nights before Viard died. If she kept personal notes, which some nurses do, off system, because the charting software has a 15-minute lag and you need to keep track of things in real time, she may have what was in those files. Would she talk to us? Lena thought about Dara Shields, mid-40s, careful, the kind of nurse who'd been at Hartwell long enough to know where the bodies were metaphorically buried and had therefore learned to keep her head down. She'd looked away in the hallway this morning, like most of them, but she'd also been the one, 2 weeks ago, who'd left a Post-it note on Lena's locker that said, Holt signed off on early discharge for room 9 again. Doesn't look right to me. Anonymous in the way that people are anonymous when they want to flag something without attaching their name to it. She might, Lena said, if she feels safe, and if she knows the deletion happened, she might reach out before we even have to find her. Calloway nodded slowly. He looked like a man rerunning a calculation and arriving at a number that was both better and worse than he'd started with. Get some sleep, he said. There's a back room. 3 hours if you can take them. I'm fine, Lena said. You're functional, he said. There's a difference. 3 hours. Boone can stay with you. She started to argue and then didn't, because he was right, and she'd been in enough situations to know that running on empty was a choice that always extracted payment eventually. She stood, and Boone stood, and she crossed the room toward the back hallway. She was almost through the door when the analyst's voice came again. Different this time. Tighter. Calloway, we've got a problem. She stopped. Dara Shields, the analyst said. Her home address is in the federal database. She's listed as a witness in a preliminary inquiry from 2 months ago. Someone accessed that record. Another pause. 40 minutes ago. From inside the hospital network. The room went quiet. Lena turned around. Calloway was looking at her. She's not safe, Lena said. No, he said. She's not. He was already reaching for his jacket. Lena was already moving back toward the center of the room, Boone at her left side. The tiredness evaporating the way it does when the situation reclassifies itself and your body decides that sleep is someone else's problem. Tell me her address, she said. Calloway had the address pulled up before Lena finished the sentence. Dara Shields lived on Pembroke Court, a residential street about 9 minutes east, single-family homes, the kind of neighborhood where people left porch lights on and didn't think about why. Calloway was already moving, pulling his jacket, issuing instructions across the room in the compressed, no-wasted syllable way that Lena recognized from a previous life. Reyes, take the secondary vehicle. Hart, you're with me. Boone comes. Nobody argued about the dog. Nobody who knew Boone ever argued about the dog. They were out the door in 90 seconds. Calloway drove. Not fast enough to draw attention, but with the particular precision of someone who has calculated exactly how much speed he can carry through each turn without creating a problem. Lena sat in the passenger seat watching the city move past and running the geometry of it in her head. 40 minutes since the hospital network access, which meant whoever had pulled Shields' address had a 40-minute head start. 9 minutes to Pembroke Court. Variables. Whether they'd moved immediately on getting the address, whether there were additional steps needed on their end, whether the goal was intimidation or something worse. The goal mattered. Intimidation meant there was still time. Something worse meant the calculation was different. What's the read on the people Holt is working with? She asked. Above his level, they've used legal pressure and financial leverage, Calloway said. Below his level, in the contracting side, there have been 2 whistleblowers in the past year. One recanted. One had a car accident that put him in the hospital for 6 weeks. The accident, Lena said. Ruled as? Driver negligence, no charges. The investigator who pushed for a second look was transferred within a month. Lena looked out the window. So they're willing to go physical when the stakes are high enough. And the stakes are currently very high, Calloway said. Neither of them said anything else for the rest of the drive. Pembroke Court was quiet. Porch lights, parked cars, the ordinary stillness of a neighborhood at 10:30 on a weeknight. Calloway pulled in 2 houses short of the address and cut the headlights. Reyes came in from the far end a moment later, coasting to a stop. The house at number 14 had a light on in the front room, curtains closed but backlit. A Subaru in the driveway that presumably belonged to Shields. Nothing immediately wrong. Then Boone, in the back seat, stood up. He didn't make a sound. He just stood, weight forward, and his attention locked onto something at the left side of the house near the fence line. Lena followed his eye line. Took her 3 seconds to see it, a shape that was darker than the shadow it was standing in, and it wasn't moving the way inanimate objects don't move. It was not moving in the specific way of something choosing to be still. "Left fence," she said quietly. Calloway saw it. "Reyes," he said into the radio. One word. "Copy," Reyes said. "I've got the back." They were out of the car. Lena had no weapon. That was simply the situation. She was a civilian nurse on investigative suspension with her personal phone and a federal consent form, and the Army had not issued her anything tonight except transportation and a working dog. Calloway had his sidearm, which she could see but wasn't going to pretend was her problem to manage. Her job right now was Boone, and whatever Boone could tell her about what was on the other side of that fence. She brought him up beside her, and they moved low along the parked cars toward the house. Calloway took the other side. The shape by the fence had gone still in a different way now. The way things go still when they've registered that something changed in the environment. Calloway covered the distance and the time it takes to make a decision. "Federal investigator," he said, loud and clear. "Don't move." The shape moved. It came off the fence fast and cut toward the back of the house, and Calloway went after it, and Boone pulled left hard against the leash, and Lena made a split-second call and released him. He was gone before she finished the motion. 75 pounds of trained military working dog moving at a speed that made the math very simple for the person ahead of him. It took 11 seconds. Then Boone stopped, and the shape was on the ground, and Calloway was there with his credentials out and his radio up, calling it in. Lena was already at the front door. She knocked hard. Dara Shields. My name is Lena Hart. I worked at Hartwell General. I need you to open the door." Silence. "Dara, someone accessed your address from the hospital network tonight. I'm here with a federal investigator. You need to open the door right now." A lock disengaged, then a chain. The door opened 4 inches, and Dara Shields looked at her through the gap. 53. Reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, a cardigan over her scrubs, and an expression that told Lena she had not been asleep and had not been calm for some time before this. "You," Dara said. "Me," Lena said. "Can I come in?" Dara looked past her at the street, at Calloway, at Boone trotting back toward the door with the matter-of-fact composure of a dog who has resolved the situation and is ready to move to the next task. She opened the door. The front room was small and overfurnished. Too many photos on the walls, a couch with 3 blankets on it, the particular density of a home that someone has lived in alone for long enough that it has become entirely shaped around one person's habits. Dara sat on the edge of the couch. Lena sat across from her. Calloway stayed near the door, still on his radio managing whatever was happening in the side yard. "I saw what they did to you today," Dara said. Her voice was steady, but her hands weren't entirely. She had them pressed flat on her knees. "In the hallway, when they walked you out." "I know," Lena said. "I saw you." Dara's jaw moved. "I should have said something." "It wouldn't have helped then," Lena said. "It can help now." "Do you have notes from Viard's first 2 nights?" "Off system. Anything you kept for yourself." Dara looked at her for a long time, long enough that Lena could see the calculus happening. The weight of what she knew against the weight of what saying it out loud would cost her in job security and institutional protection and the particular safety of being someone who has never made herself a target. 3 weeks ago, Dara said slowly, Dr. Holt came to the floor at 2 a.m. Not unusual for him to come in late. He did surgical rounds odd hours. But he spent 12 minutes in Viard's room alone. No nurse present, no documented reason. I was on break. My aide was covering the floor, and when I got back, she said he'd gone in, Spent some time. Come out. Didn't speak to her. Did you document it? Lena said. Not in the system. Because I told myself it was nothing, that I was reading things in. She exhaled. But I wrote it down. In my notebook. Date, time, duration. I've been doing that for 2 months. Writing down things that didn't match and not telling anyone. Why 2 months? Lena asked. Because that's when I noticed the medication discrepancies in 2 other patients Holt was involved with, Dara said. Neither of them died. One of them deteriorated and then stabilized after Holt adjusted their treatment. I couldn't prove anything was deliberate. But the pattern bothered me. The notebook, Calloway said from the doorway. We need it. Dara looked at him, then back at Lena. If I give you that, she said, what happens to me? You become a witness in a federal case, Calloway said, which comes with specific protections. Your employer cannot legally retaliate against you for cooperating with a federal investigation, and if they attempt to, that becomes an additional charge. Holt has lawyers who make things happen that aren't supposed to happen, Dara said. Holt is currently watching one of his people get detained in your side yard, Calloway said. His lawyers are going to have their hands full. Dara sat with that for a moment. Then she stood up, went to the bookshelf near the window, and pulled out a green spiral notebook from behind a row of paperbacks. She held it for a second before she handed it to Calloway. It looked like she was holding it for the last time and knew it. There are 14 entries, she said, starting October 9th. They were back at the field office by midnight. The man from the side yard had been transported. Lena didn't ask where, and Calloway didn't explain, and those were both appropriate choices. Reyes was already at a monitor with the notebook entries photographed and being processed. The analyst team had been reinforced. 2 more people had arrived while Lena was gone, which told her that what they'd found in the past few hours had moved the federal timeline. Calloway spread the case materials across the center table. Physical copies of what they had. The time-stamped photograph from room 114, the medication log with the falsified entry, Dara Shield's 14 handwritten entries, the vendor-preserved backup records, accessed and confirmed intact before the deletion protocol had run, the financial network diagram with Holt's board seats documented, and now, added in the last hour, a statement from the person detained at Shield's address who had, under the specific kind of pressure that federal detention creates, confirmed he had been sent by an intermediary connected to Holt's brother-in-law. It was not a clean chain of evidence. It was the kind of case that real cases are, assembled from pieces that each told only part of the story, meaningful only in relation to each other, dependent on the kind of contextual interpretation that required someone who had been in those hospital rooms and understood what the numbers meant. Lena was the only person in the room who was that someone. Walk me through Viard's last 48 hours, Ochoa said, sitting across from her with his recorder running. From a clinical standpoint, what should have been happening with his treatment and what the records show actually happened. She walked him through it. She used precise language, not because she was performing expertise, but because imprecision in a medical context was how things got misread, and she wasn't going to let anything she said become a source of ambiguity in a federal record. The respiratory presentation, the appropriate treatment protocol, the specific medication Holt had ordered on day 2 that was technically within range for a standard patient but aggressive for someone with Viard's admission blood work. The way the overnight oxygenation drops had been charted as fluctuations within normal variance when the numbers themselves didn't support that characterization. The IV adjustment in the final hours that the falsified entry had been designed to attach to Lena's credentials. Ochoa asked good questions. She answered them carefully. Partway through, one of the analysts, young woman, quick, who'd been running 3 screens simultaneously, turned from her workstation and said, "Calloway, I found something in the vendor backup." The room shifted. There's a secondary user account in the Hartwell Medical Record System, separate from all staff credentials. Admin-level access, no activity in the logs under any named user. It was used 6 times over the past 90 days, and every instance corresponded to a modification in either Viard's file or the files of 2 other patients Shields flagged. Ghost account, Calloway said, registered under a maintenance contractor. But the maintenance contractor hasn't had an active hospital contract for 7 months. The account should have been deactivated. It wasn't. Prescott, Lena said. Prescott or someone Prescott gave access to, the analyst said. The last login was at 0539 this morning. But there is 8 minutes before the falsified medication entry was logged under Lena's credentials. The sequence assembled itself clearly. The ghost account accessed the system, navigated to Viard's chart, generated the entry, and attached it to Lena's credential identifier. In and out in under 10 minutes, leaving the timestamp that was supposed to end her career and close the investigation before it opened. It had been fast. It had been technically clean. And it had failed because a nurse on the tail end of an overnight shift had taken a photograph of a wall-mounted tablet because something in her gut said, "Document this." Calloway looked at Lena across the table. She looked back at him. Neither of them said anything because there wasn't anything to say that the room hadn't already understood. At 2:17 a.m., Calloway's phone rang. He stepped away to take it, and when he came back, his expression had changed in a specific way that Lena had learned over years meant the situation had expanded. "That was the federal prosecutor's office," he said. "They've been reviewing what we've passed up tonight. They're moving the timeline." "How far?" Reyes asked. "Arrest warrant for Prescott is being prepared now. For Holt, it's more complicated. The connection between him and Viard's death is solid, but the chain through the intermediary to the contractor level still needs one more link before they'll authorize." He paused. "But they're not waiting weeks. They want to move within 72 hours. "What's the missing link?" Lena asked. Calloway sat down. He looked at the network diagram on the monitor. "Holt's brother-in-law, a man named Gareth Mull, runs the primary contracting firm. Everything above Holt routes through Mull. We have the financial connections. We have Holt's board seats. We have the falsified records. What we don't have is direct evidence that Mull knew the plan extended to Viard's death, that it was coordinated rather than Holt acting as a rogue individual." "If it's just Holt, the upper level walks," Reyes said. "The upper level walks, the contracts get restructured. 2 people at the bottom take the charges, and in 18 months the same operation is running under different names," Calloway said. "Which is what happened to the last investigation, 5 years ago." Lena stared at the diagram. She thought about the network of lines connecting Holt to Mull, to the procurement official to the subcontractors, and about the specific way that systems like this survived, by insulating the people at the top from the decisions made at the bottom, by maintaining a layer of plausible ignorance that was not ignorance at all, but was structured to look like it. "Viard," she said. "In the 2 days he was at Hartwell, did he have any visitors?" Ochoa looked up from his notes. "1. Day 2, early evening. Logged as a personal acquaintance. Name given at the front desk was," he flipped back through his notes, "Raymond Saul. Is Saul in your system?" "No direct record under that name." "What did he look like?" Lena asked. Ochoa looked at the analyst. The analyst pulled up something on the secondary monitor. A still frame from the hospital's visitor log camera, the angle catching someone at the front desk signing in. Late 50s, well-dressed, the kind of man who wore a collared shirt even when he wasn't working. Lena looked at the image. Then she looked at the network diagram. There was a small photograph attached to one of the nodes near the top, a standard headshot that had been pulled from a corporate filing somewhere in the chain. She looked between the 2 images. "Pull up Gareth Mull's full photo archive," she said. The analyst did. The second image, a photograph from a regional business profile from 2 years ago, same man, same jaw, same particular way of holding his shoulders, came up on screen. The room went quiet. "He visited Viard the day before Holt made the medication adjustment," Lena said. "He was there in person. He signed the visitor log under a false name, which means he knew he didn't want a record of being there, which means he knew what was going to happen to Viard," Calloway said. "The visitor log is a hospital record," Lena said. "It's in the backup?" The analyst was already checking. "Yes. Visitor logs are retained in the same system as the medical records. The backup has them." Calloway picked up his phone and called the federal prosecutor's office back. He spoke for less than 3 minutes. When he hung up, he stood very still for a moment in the way that people stand when something they've been working toward for a long time just became real. "Warrants expanded," he said. "All 3. Prescott, Holt, Mull. Execution tomorrow at 0800. Reyes exhaled. The analyst turned back to her screen. Ochoa closed his recorder, capped his pen, and said, "Ms. Hart, for what it's worth, the case breaks here tonight because of what you did at 7:06 this morning in that room." Lena didn't answer. She was looking at the visitor log still frame on the monitor, at Gareth Mull signing in as Raymond Saul, wearing a collared shirt in a hospital where a man was 2 days away from being killed and couldn't see it coming. She thought about Thomas Veard, about what he'd known and carried and what it had cost him. "Get some sleep," Calloway said. He was saying it to everyone, but he looked at Lena. "We're going to need you at 0700 for the pre-execution briefing. You'll be on site as a medical consultant to verify records identification in real time." "On site," she said. "At Hartwell." "At Hartwell," he said, "in an official capacity. Whatever Holt thinks is happening tomorrow morning, what's actually happening is different." She nodded. She found the back room. She lay down on the cot they'd set up there, and Boone arranged himself on the floor beside her, his weight against her leg, steady and warm in the way of things that have never once doubted their own purpose. She was asleep in under 4 minutes. She was awake again at 6:43. Not because anyone woke her, but because her body had kept its own clock running, and 6:43 was when she'd learned over years that the last window of real rest was closing and whatever came next was already arriving whether she was ready or not. She sat up. Boone raised his head. From the main room, she could hear movement, voices, the sound of equipment being organized. She could hear Calloway on the phone, and Reyes, and the analyst who hadn't slept at all working through something with fast, quiet keystrokes. She put her feet on the floor and looked at the wall. 48 minutes. She'd spent 23 months at Hartwell General. 2 years of early shifts and careful invisibility, and colleagues who knew her name but not her past. She'd chosen that hospital for the same reason she'd chosen Raleigh. Not because of what it offered, but because of what it didn't demand. Nobody at Hartwell had ever asked her who she was before she arrived, and she'd liked that, and she'd built something inside those limitations that felt, if not like home, then like a reasonable shape for a life. In 48 minutes, she was going back there. Not as the nurse they'd escorted out, not with her head down, not with the weight of someone else's accusation still attached to her name. She stood up. She thought about what Calloway had said on the phone last night. What's actually happening is different. She thought about Holt arriving at 7:41 yesterday morning with his decision already made, and the 31 faces in the hallway, and the security officer who'd said, "I'm sorry," and meant it, and the specific quality of silence that fills a space when an institution closes ranks around its own failure and expects the person it has failed to simply absorb it and disappear. She picked up her bag. Boone was already at the door. She heard it before she reached the main room. A second phone ringing, an unfamiliar tone, and then Reyes saying something short and sharp, and then a silence that had a different weight than the silences that had come before it. She pushed through the door. Reyes was standing in the center of the room looking at Calloway, and Calloway's face had rearranged itself into an expression Lena had seen exactly twice before in her time working with him, both times in situations where a plan had encountered something it wasn't designed for. "What happened?" Lena said. Not a question. Calloway looked at her. "Holt's not at his residence," he said. "He didn't go home last night. His car is at the hospital. Security shows him badging in at 11:48 p.m. and no badge out." "He's been in the building all night," Lena said. "Yes." "Does he know about the warrants?" "We don't know." "If he's been in the building since midnight and he hasn't left..." Lena stopped. Something was assembling itself in her head, fast and cold. The server room, the hospital's backup hardware, the local mirror before it syncs to the vendor. If someone with admin access ran a physical wipe directly on the hardware rather than through the network, the vendor backup would be unaffected, but everything on site would be gone, the analyst said from her station, voice flat. And we'd have to go through federal process to get the vendor data admitted, which takes time, Calloway said. It takes time, which delays the warrants. "How much access does Holt have to the server room?" Reyes asked. "He's chief of surgery," Lena said. "He doesn't have IT admin access, but Prescott does, and Prescott..." Her phone rang. Unknown number, but not the same local area code as last night. This one was a hospital exchange. She knew the prefix, had dialed it 100 times from her personal phone when she was picking up a shift or checking a schedule. She answered it. Silence. Then breathing. Then a voice she recognized, not because she knew it well, but because she'd heard it 3 times in the past year in the hallway outside the server room when the IT department was running late maintenance. Ms. Hart! A male voice, young, running on something between panic and resolve. My name is Prescott. I need to talk to you. The room around her had gone completely still. I'm listening, she said. I can't do this anymore, he said. What Holt is asking me to do tonight, I didn't know it was going to go this far. I didn't know about Veyard. I thought it was records management. I thought... He stopped. I'm in the building right now. Holt is with me. He doesn't know I'm calling. Lena looked at Calloway. He was already moving, already coordinating. Prescott, she said, keeping her voice level. Where in the building are you? A pause, and then very quietly. Lower level, server room B, and Ms. Hart! He's not alone. There's someone else here. Someone I've never seen before, and I don't... His voice dropped further. I don't know what he's going to do. The line didn't go dead, but it went silent, and the silence had a texture that made the hair on Lena's arms stand up. The particular held breath quality of someone who has just heard a sound that they should not be hearing from a direction that means they are no longer alone. Lena kept the phone pressed to her ear and did not move. The silence on Prescott's end had that specific quality. Not dead air, not a dropped call, but the held breath silence of someone who had just become aware of something in their immediate environment that changed every calculation they'd made in the last 60 seconds. She could hear the faint mechanical hum of server hardware. She could hear, very faintly, footsteps. Then the line went dead. Calloway was already at the table, pulling on his jacket. Reyes, get the tactical unit moving. We have federal warrant authority. We're not waiting for local coordination. The warrant execution was scheduled for 0800, Reyes said. The warrant exists now, Calloway said. 0800 was a courtesy. This isn't. Lena was already at the door. If Holt is running a physical wipe on the server hardware and he has someone with him that Prescott doesn't recognize, we're not looking at a panicked surgeon making a bad decision at midnight. Someone planned for the warrants. Someone knew the timeline. Calloway looked at her. You think there's a leak? I think it's worth considering, she said. Or Holt has someone monitoring federal court filings in real time, which a man with enough money and the right attorney absolutely can do. Neither answer was good. Both were possible. There was no time to resolve which one was true. You stay behind the tactical unit, Calloway said to her. Non-negotiable. I'm the only person in this group who knows every floor of that hospital, Lena said, including the lower level, including the server room layout. Then you stay close and you tell me what I need to know. You don't go through a door first. Agreed, she said. It wasn't a comfortable agreement, but it was the one available. Well, they moved in 2 vehicles with a 4-person tactical unit that had materialized from somewhere Lena didn't ask about. Federal level, quiet, professional. The kind of people who carried their gear like it was part of their body and didn't speak more than necessary. Boone rode in the back with Lena, and she kept her hand on him not for his benefit but for hers, because the pressure of his weight against her side was something to calibrate against while she mentally mapped the hospital's lower level. Server Room B was at the end of the Eastern Maintenance Corridor, below the main ER, accessible from 2 points. The primary entrance from the main corridor, which would require a badge scan, and a secondary access through the medical record storage area, which connected to Server Room B through an internal door that was supposed to require a dual-key authorization, but which Lena had watched the IT crew prop open with a door wedge every time they ran maintenance, because the dual-key mechanism was slow and they were always behind schedule. Hospitals, she had learned over 2 years, ran on the gap between what the policy said and what people actually did when the policy was inconvenient. She told Calloway about the secondary access on the drive over. He relayed it to the tactical unit. They adjusted the approach. Hartwell General, at 3 a.m. from the outside, looked like a building that had turned most of itself off. The ER entrance still lit, the ambulance bay operational, the upper floors dark except for the nursing station lights. From the street, it looked like a place where people were sleeping or recovering, ordinary and institutional. Lena had spent enough time inside its walls to know what the building held. They entered from 2 points, Calloway, Lena, and Boone, through the medical record storage access. The tactical unit through the primary maintenance corridor. The goal was to have both entrances covered simultaneously so that whatever was happening in server room B couldn't walk out either door. The medical record storage room was dim, rows of physical filing cabinets that still existed because some departments hadn't fully converted, and beyond them, shelving units of archived boxes going back 15 years. Lena moved through it without needing to think about the path. She'd pulled files in here during 2 night shifts when the digital system was down for maintenance and a patient's historical records were needed for an emergency consult. She knew the layout the way you know a room you've been in often enough that your feet remember it. The internal door at the far end had a thin line of light under it. Calloway put his hand up. They stopped. Boone had gone into his working posture. Not alert in the reactive sense, but focused, tracking something through the door that Lena's senses couldn't catch yet. His head was low and his weight was balanced forward, and he was reading whatever was on the other side with everything he had. Calloway leaned to the radio, subvocal, barely audible. "Primary team, hold on my mark. 30 seconds. He looked at Lena. She held up 2 fingers, 2 people, based on what Prescott had said. He nodded. He held up his hand, counted down with his fingers, and pushed the door. Server room B was the size of a large classroom, cold from the climate control that kept the hardware from overheating, lit by the blue-white glow of indicator lights running down the rows of racks. It smelled like electronics and recycled air. Marcus Holt was standing at the primary server rack with his back to the door, and his hand was on a drive housing that should not have been open. He turned at the sound of the door, and his face went through several things very quickly. Surprise, calculation, and then a version of composure that was clearly manufactured and that Lena recognized as the same face he'd worn when he'd told her the entry was logged to her credentials. The man beside him was someone she didn't recognize, 50s, thick-shouldered, the kind of physical presence that is not accidental, wearing civilian clothes that had a very faint military quality in the cut and the fit. He had his hands at his sides, and his attention had shifted entirely to Calloway and the tactical unit coming through the primary door simultaneously. Prescott was against the far wall, away from both of them, his face the color of old paper. He had his hands visibly at his sides and was not moving. "Federal investigator," Calloway said, loud and clear. "Dr. Holt, step away from the server rack. Do it now." Holt did not step away immediately. He held position for 2 seconds. 2 seconds in which he looked at the tactical unit, then at Calloway, then past Calloway to Lena, and in that final look something changed in his expression in a way that was harder to read than the previous ones. Then he stepped back from the rack. "I'm here in my administrative capacity," he said. "I have authorization to access hospital systems at any hour." "You have authorization to access clinical systems," Calloway said. "The drive housing you had your hand on is the backup node for the hospital's medical records primary server. Unauthorized physical modification of that hardware in the context of an active federal investigation is obstruction." He crossed the room and looked at the rack without touching it. "How far did you get?" Holt said nothing. Calloway looked at the thick-shouldered man. "And you are?" No answer. "Okay," Calloway said in the tone of someone who has moved past that question for now. He looked at the tactical unit. Both of them. They were separated, walked to opposite ends of the room, and the thick-shouldered man went without resistance, which Lena noted. People who go without resistance when resistance was physically possible have done a calculation and decided cooperation serves them better. That was usually because they had a plan for what came after the cooperation, or because someone had told them to stay clean until a certain point. She didn't like it. She moved to Prescott against the wall. He looked at her the way someone looks at a person they called because they couldn't think of anyone else to call, with relief and shame mixed together in a proportion that didn't resolve cleanly. "How much did he get?" she asked, low. "He opened the housing," Prescott said. "He hadn't started the wipe. I stalled him." He swallowed. "I told him the process needed a manual initialization code that had to be entered from my station first. I made it up. I just..." I needed time. Lena looked at him for a moment. That was smart. I didn't feel smart, he said. I felt sick. Those aren't mutually exclusive, she said. The records. They're intact? The primary backup is intact. Everything we discussed, the ghost account entries, the falsified logs, the deletion attempts from last night that we stopped, all of it. He looked at the server rack. He would have wiped all of it if he'd gotten 10 more minutes. He didn't, Lena said. She meant it as a simple statement, but Prescott's face did something complicated when she said it, and she thought she understood why. He'd been the one who'd given those 10 minutes, and that act had cost him something he wasn't going to get back. The arrest of Marcus Holt happened in the blue-white light of server room B at 3:22 a.m., and it was not dramatic in the way that arrests in television are dramatic. There were no shouted denials, no final speeches. Holt stood very still when the federal agent read him his rights, and his jaw was tight, and he looked straight ahead rather than at anyone in the room, and the composure he maintained was genuine in a way that told Lena it wasn't new. He'd been managing his exposure for a long time, and he was still doing it even now, still calculating what the right posture was for this moment. She watched him walk out of server room B and didn't feel the satisfaction she might have expected. What she felt was more like the release of a sustained tension, the specific relief of a situation that has been pulling in wrong directions finally resolving in the direction of accuracy. Thomas Viard was still dead. That didn't change. What changed was what his death was going to mean, and what record it would leave, and whether the people responsible for it were going to absorb its consequences or redirect them onto someone easier to sacrifice. The thick-shouldered man was a different matter. He'd been cooperative in a way that continued to bother her, and when Calloway came back into the server room after the tactical unit took Holt out, the expression on his face confirmed it. "He's asking for a deal," Calloway said. Already. He says he has information about Mull's involvement that goes beyond the visitor log, direct communication records. He says he was hired through Mull's secondary contact network, and he has documentation. He came prepared to cooperate, Lena said. Or he came prepared for the possibility of needing to, Calloway said. Which means someone in this network is more interested in self-preservation than loyalty, which is the thing that makes networks like this fall apart, Lena said. Calloway almost smiled. Almost. Get some coffee. We're going to be here a while. The next 6 hours were the kind of work that doesn't make it into stories because it doesn't have a clean shape. Federal agents moving through the hospital with IT forensics personnel, Prescott sitting with Ochoa giving a full statement that ran close to 4 hours, the server room sealed as an evidence site, and Lena in a side office with a cup of coffee that was technically coffee, and a laptop that Calloway had authorized her to use to walk the forensics team through the medical record structure, identifying which files corresponded to which clinical decisions and explaining, in terms a non-clinician could follow exactly what each modification had changed and why it mattered. It was detailed, methodical, and exhausting, and it was the kind of work she was good at. Partway through the morning, Dara Shields arrived, brought in by Reyes, voluntary, looking like someone who had not slept but had made a decision in the night that had settled something in her and she was carrying the weight of it differently now. She sat with the forensics team and walked them through the 14 entries in her notebook one by one, and Lena could hear her through the office wall, her voice steady, naming dates and times and specific clinical observations with the precision of someone who has been watching carefully for a long time and finally has somewhere for what she's seen to go. At 9:40 a.m., the news broke. Lena found out because the hospital's day shift had started arriving at 7, and by 8:30, the building had the charged, disrupted quality of a place where something large had happened, and the information was spreading in the uncontrolled human way that information spreads in institutions. Hallway conversations. Someone who'd seen the federal vehicles outside calling someone on the 3rd floor. The nursing station bulletin board still showing the normal day's schedule, while the floor below it was a federal evidence scene. By 9:40, it was on local news. Chief surgeon at Hartwell General arrested in federal investigation. Hospital, placed under administrative review. Lena was sitting in the side office when one of the younger federal analysts came in, set his phone on the table in front of her with the news article visible, and said, "Thought you should see it," and then left without further comment. She read the first 3 paragraphs. Holt's name, the obstruction charge, the broader investigation into the contracting network, no mention of her name, which was both accurate and, she recognized, temporary. Her name would surface eventually. Right now, the story was about the people being charged. She set the phone down. The office had a window that looked out into the main hallway. She could see through the glass partition as day shift nurses and staff moved past, and she could see the moment when people started connecting what they were reading on their phones to where they were standing, and she could see in the body language of the hallway the specific discomfort of people who had been present yesterday morning when a nurse was walked out under accusation and who were now processing what that meant in the light of what was happening today. She watched a nurse she recognized, Petra, who worked ortho, who had been in the ER hallway yesterday morning and who had very deliberately looked at the floor when Lana passed, stop walking and stand very still in the middle of the hallway, reading something on her phone, and then look up, and for a moment look directly at the glass of the side office window, directly at Lena, with an expression that wasn't comfortable to read because it wasn't comfortable to have. Lena didn't look away. She didn't perform anything. Not forgiveness, not accusation. She just held the eye contact until Petra looked down again and kept walking. Gareth Mall was arrested at his home outside the city at 10:17 a.m. Calloway told her in the hallway outside the evidence processing area. Brief, factual, the way he delivered information when the information was significant, and he didn't want to oversell it. The deal the third party cut gave us what we needed for the direct communication records. Mull tried to get ahead of it. Had his attorney contact the prosecutor's office at 8 this morning. Too late. Prescott, Lena said. What happens to him? Cooperating witness. He'll take consequences for the credential forgery and the unauthorized access. Reduced charges in exchange for testimony. Calloway paused. He's not walking away from this. But he's not going to prison for what Holt and Mull did either. Lena nodded. It wasn't a clean outcome for Prescott. Clean outcomes weren't the kind this situation produced. What it produced were accurate outcomes, which were different. The nursing board, she said. The complaint Holt filed yesterday morning has been formally withdrawn, Calloway said. The board received notification from the prosecutor's office before 9 a.m. that the complaint was filed as part of a pattern of obstruction. They've opened a review of the complaint itself, not of your license. She let herself hear that. Not the way she'd been waiting to hear it, because she hadn't let herself start waiting. Waiting for outcomes you can't control was a habit that cost more than it returned, and she'd learned that in contexts where the cost was very literal, but she let herself hear it. The hospital's administrative review, Calloway continued. The board of directors has been formally notified of the investigation scope. Holt's position is suspended pending outcome. You'll receive a formal communication about your employment status by end of day. I already know what I'm going to do about my employment status, Lena said. Calloway looked at her. I'm not going back to the floor, she said. Not at Hartwell. What happened here? The thing that let Veard's situation get as far as it did. It's not fixed by arresting one surgeon. It's a structural gap in how patient records are monitored for modification, how staff credential security is managed, how anomalies in treatment patterns get flagged. She paused. There should have been a system that caught what Prescott did with the ghost account in the first month. There wasn't, because nobody was specifically looking, because nobody had designed the system to look. You sound like someone who has thought about this for longer than last night, Calloway said. I thought about it on the bus home yesterday morning, she said. I had time. He was quiet for a moment. There's a federal patient safety liaison position that works with hospitals in multi-state regions. It's designed exactly for what you're describing. Systemic review, security protocols, cross-institutional anomaly identification. He said it carefully, not like a pitch, like information. It's been open for 2 months. The qualification criteria are flexible for the right candidate. She looked at him. You've been sitting on that for a while. Since about midnight, he said. I didn't want to lead with it. You had other things going on. She almost laughed. Almost. I'll read the criteria, she said. At 11:40 a.m., the state procurement official, whose name was listed on Calloway's network diagram near the top of the web, was placed under a federal hold pending a grand jury review that had been accelerated in light of the morning's developments. He was not arrested yet. The chain connecting him to the contracting fraud required a longer evidentiary development, but he was no longer able to move freely, could not access relevant financial accounts, and had been formally informed by his agency's oversight board that he was suspended from his position pending investigation. His name appeared in the noon news cycle alongside Mull's. By that point, Lena was back in the main building, having been formally reauthorized by hospital security with a temporary access designation that was an awkward institutional solution to the fact that she was simultaneously a suspended staff member, a federal evidence consultant, and a named victim of a forged documentation scheme. The badge they gave her was a visitor badge with federal consultation written on it in black marker, which was the most bureaucratically unglamorous thing that had ever happened to her, and which somehow made the whole morning feel more real than anything else had. She walked the ER floor at 11:50 with her visitor badge and her temporary authorization, doing what she'd been asked to do by the forensics team. Walk the physical space and confirm for the record that certain locations they had photographed corresponded to her observations from the previous morning. The IV set up in room 114. The wall-mounted tablet. The corridor sight lines from the nurse's station. She did this work with the measured focus of someone doing a specific task, and she did not let herself feel the accumulated weight of standing in the room where Thomas Viard had died. Mostly. The crash cart was still in its standard position. The room had been cleaned. There was no physical trace of the code. The tablet was dark. She stood in the room for the time it took to complete what she'd been asked to confirm, and then she stood there for a little longer than that, not moving, not performing any version of what it looked like to grieve for a patient. Just standing in the room where she'd run a code she hadn't known was the endpoint of a plan designed months in advance, and letting that sit with the full weight it had. Then she left the room. In the corridor, a nurse she didn't know well, early 30s, the kind of face that hadn't found its settled expression yet, stopped her. "You're Lena Hart," the nurse said. "Yeah," Lena said. "I was on night shift last week. I heard Holt tell the charge nurse that you'd made a medication error 6 months ago that had been covered up. As context, about why nobody should be surprised about what happened." She said it with the specific, uncomfortable directness of someone who knows the information they're delivering is not going to be easy to hear. "I thought you should know he was saying things like that, before yesterday." Lena looked at her. "How long has he been saying things like that?" "About you specifically? I started hearing it maybe 3 weeks ago." The nurse paused. "I didn't know who you were. I had no reason to question it. She stopped. "I'm sorry I didn't question it." Lena understood what this was. It was not an apology for a specific action. This nurse hadn't done anything to her directly. It was the apology that people offer when they realize they've been an instrument of something without knowing it, when the fog of institutional narrative clears and they see the shape of what they were participating in. It was an uncomfortable apology to receive because it was honest, and because the right response to it wasn't reassurance. "He was building it in advance," Lena said. "The story he was going to tell about why I made the mistake. He needed it to be plausible before it happened." She paused. "That's not on you. That's what premeditation looks like when it's being done carefully." The nurse nodded, not entirely comfortably, and moved on. Lena walked back toward the evidence processing area. At 2:15 p.m., Ochoa found her in the side office reviewing the final evidence log and asked her to come to the main room. She came. The room had filled, more people, more equipment, and at the center table, 3 monitors now running, the case materials assembled and cross-referenced in a way that had the organized density of a thing coming together rather than coming apart. Calloway was on a call. He saw her come in, held up a hand, "Wait," and finished the call. "Federal Prosecutor's Office," he said. "They're proceeding with indictment on all 3 primary targets. The charges against you have been officially withdrawn, and a formal letter of clearance will be issued within 48 hours. That will go to the hospital, the nursing board, and your personnel file. The nursing board has already been contacted informally." Lena sat down. She pressed her hands flat on the table the way Dara Shields had pressed her hands flat on her own knees last night, and she held them there until the muscles in her forearms stopped carrying the tension of the past 36 hours. The position I mentioned, Calloway said. Yes. You'd need to read a full brief. There's a formal application process. It's a federal liaison role, so there's background review, but your military record streamlines a significant portion of that. He paused. It would mean you're not a floor nurse anymore. It would mean working across institutions, and you'd be in rooms where people don't want you to be, asking questions people don't want asked. You're describing that like it should discourage me, Lena said. I'm describing it accurately, he said. She almost laughed again. She'd almost laughed more times in the past 12 hours than she had in the previous 6 months put together, and she didn't know what to do with that except let it mean what it meant. Send me the brief, she said. Boone, who had been asleep under the table for the past 2 hours with the profound commitment of a dog who has completed his work and is taking his rest seriously, lifted his head, looked at her, and put his head back down. She looked at him for a moment, then at the monitors, at the case that was built, the names that were on it, the chain of evidence that ran from a photograph she'd taken at 7:06 a.m. the previous morning all the way to federal indictments and a network diagram that was going to take the prosecutor's office months to fully address. She thought about Thomas Veard and what had been taken from him, and she thought about Dara Shields pressing her notebook into Calloway's hands, and she thought about the 31 people in the hallway who'd looked away, most of whom were just human, most of whom were just afraid. She was sitting in that thought when Reyes appeared in the doorway with an expression that made Lena's attention sharpen before Reyes had said a word. We have a problem, Reyes said. Calloway looked up. Mull's attorney filed an emergency motion 40 minutes ago, Reyes said. They're challenging the visitor log evidence on chain of custody grounds. The argument is that because the backup vendor data was accessed by the federal team prior to the formal warrant being extended to that specific data set, there's a window where the evidence could be deemed inadmissible, Calloway said. They're not going to win it, Reyes said. But the motion creates a delay in the indictment timeline for Mull specifically, and while the motion is pending, his hold is reviewed, Calloway said. His attorney is arguing he's a flight risk if the hold isn't confirmed within, Reyes checked her phone, 6 hours. If the motion creates enough procedural complexity in that window, there's a possibility the hold isn't renewed in time. The room absorbed that. Lena thought about the timeline, the warrant extension, the moment the federal hold had gone through on the vendor backup data. She had been in this room when it happened. She had heard the analyst confirm it. She knew the sequence. She looked up. The hold on the vendor backup data went through before we had confirmation of the warrant extension, she said slowly. But the data we used from the backup to identify Mull, the visitor log, that came from the preservation hold, not the investigative warrant. The preservation hold doesn't require the same warrant basis. It's a separate legal instrument. Ochoa, who had been standing near the door, straightened slightly. A preservation hold is a separate instrument, he confirmed. It's issued to prevent destruction of evidence. It doesn't require the investigative scope that a search warrant requires. So the visitor log data was preserved under a different authority than the one Mull's attorney is challenging, Lena said, which means the chain of custody argument doesn't apply to the visitor log the way his attorney is claiming, Ochoa said. He was already pulling out his phone. Because the challenge is to the investigative warrant scope, and the preservation hold is not the same instrument, Calloway said. He looked at Lena. She looked back at him. She was not an attorney. She was not a federal agent. She was a nurse who had been suspended from her job 31 hours ago for a crime she hadn't committed, sitting in a borrowed federal field office in a building she'd spent 2 years trying to make herself invisible in, having just explained to a room of federal investigators the legal distinction that was going to prevent the man at the top of a murder and fraud network from walking out on a procedural technicality. There was a silence in the room. Then Calloway said, I need the prosecutor on the phone right now. And Ochoa was already dialing, and Reyes was looking at Lena with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite anything Lena had a clean word for. The call connected. Ochoa spoke for 60 seconds, referencing the preservation hold instrument, the chain of custody challenge, the separation between investigative and preservation authority. He listened. He said 3 words. Understood. Stand by. And looked at Calloway. They need 30 minutes to verify the instrument basis and file a response to the motion, Ochoa said. If the verification holds, the challenge fails, and Mull's hold is confirmed. 30 minutes. Calloway sat down for the first time in what looked like several hours and pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose. 30 minutes, he said. The room settled into the particular held tension of people waiting for a clock to run while someone else makes a decision. Lena sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling and thought about nothing for a moment, which was the closest she'd come to rest since she'd woken up on Pembroke Court's detour route back to the field office. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. An email from Hartwell General's administrative offices, sent at 2:47 p.m. with a subject line that read, R.E., employment status, Hart, Lena M. She opened it. She read the first paragraph, then the second, then the third, which she read twice. The fourth paragraph was short. 1 sentence. She set the phone face down on the table and looked at the room, at Calloway's closed eyes, at Ochoa on the phone, at Boone asleep under the table, at the monitors running case data, at the window that showed the Hartwell General parking lot where federal vehicles sat beside hospital staff vehicles in a configuration that would have been unthinkable 24 hours ago. The fourth paragraph said, in recognition of the formal withdrawal of all pending actions against Ms. Hart, the hospital's board of directors wishes to extend an offer of reinstatement at the level of senior clinical coordinator, with an adjusted compensation structure and a mandate to conduct a systemic review of patient record security protocols. She didn't say anything about it. Not yet. Not until the 30 minutes were done, and the motion was resolved, and the hold on Mull was confirmed, and the thing they'd built through this entire night was standing on its own without any more weight on it that she could apply. The 30 minutes ran. At 3:19 p.m., Ochoa's phone rang. He answered it. He listened for 40 seconds. The motion fails, he said. Preservation hold is confirmed as a separate instrument. Mull's hold stands. Calloway exhaled. Reyes said something under her breath in a language Lena didn't speak, but the tone was universal. The analyst at the far monitor turned to look at the room with an expression she couldn't entirely contain, and Boone, under the table, shifted in his sleep and made a sound that was almost a sigh, the way dogs do when they're dreaming of something that requires a lot of running and they're doing well at it. Lena looked at Calloway. There's one more thing, she said. He waited. I need to go back to the main floor, she said, before the day shift ends. There's something I need to confirm in Viard's physical admission record, the paper intake form that the ER team completes on arrival before it gets entered into the system. Paper forms are stored in the ward file cabinet for 30 days before they're scanned. She paused. The system records can be altered. The paper form can't be altered after the fact without physical evidence of tampering. If Holt or Prescott changed the digital record on day 1 to make Viard's condition look more stable than it was on arrival, the paper form is going to show different numbers. Calloway stared at her. The paper form. Nobody thought about the paper form, Lena said, because everyone assumes the paper form and the digital record match. They assume that because 99% of the time they do. And in this case, if they don't match, it means the falsification started from the moment Viard walked through the door, Lena said, which changes the timeline of premeditation significantly, which changes what Holt can be charged with. Calloway stood up. Show me the file cabinet, he said. She stood. Boone stood. And as she walked out of the side office and back into the hallway of Hartwell General for the third time in 36 hours, she felt the building differently than she ever had in the 2 years she'd worked inside it. Not as the institution that had replaced the one she'd left when she was discharged. Not as the careful, ordinary life she'd tried to construct inside its routines, but as what it actually was. A place, with specific rooms and specific records and specific people who had made specific choices inside its walls. She walked to the ER ward file cabinet, and Calloway walked beside her, and Boone padded ahead of both of them as if he'd always known exactly where he was going. She opened the cabinet drawer marked V. She pulled the intake form. She looked at the numbers on the line marked O2 saturation on admission. Then she looked at what the digital record showed for the same data point. They were different, not by accident, by 12%, a gap that moved Viard from the category of concerning but stable to the category of a patient who should have been placed on a significantly higher monitoring protocol the moment he came through the door, with additional specialist involvement and a medication approach that was substantially more conservative than what Holt had ordered, which meant the falsification had begun not in the final 48 hours of Viard's life. It had begun in the first 4 minutes. She handed the form to Calloway without speaking. He looked at it. He looked at the digital record on the tablet mounted beside the cabinet. He pulled out his phone. He dialed. When the prosecutor's office answered, he said, "We have a paper intake form that predates any digital access. The premeditation timeline moves back 14 days. A pause. "Yes, I'm holding it." The hallway was empty around them. Somewhere above, the hospital moved through its afternoon rhythms. Shift change approaching, the sound of carts and conversations, and the ordinary machinery of a place where people were trying to keep other people alive. Lena stood in that hallway with the cabinet drawer still open and looked at the intake form in Calloway's hand and thought about 14 days, about what it meant that 14 days before Viard died, someone had looked at him through the lens of what they intended to do to him and had already begun writing the story backward. She closed the cabinet drawer. "That's everything," she said. Calloway looked at her over his phone. She wasn't sure that was entirely true, and she could see from his expression that he wasn't either. 2 hours later, she found out exactly how right they both were to doubt it. When the analyst who'd been running secondary background checks on the case's peripheral connections walked into the side office and set a printed document on the table in front of her, and the name at the top of it was one she recognized, and it was not Holt's name, and it was not Mull's name, and it was not the procurement official's name. It was the name of the person who had referred Thomas Viard to Hartwell General in the first place. The name on the document was Dr. Felicia Strand. Lena read it twice. Then she set the page flat on the table and looked at it the way you look at something that reframes everything around it. Not because the information is impossible, but because it forces a reorganization of everything you thought you understood about the shape of what happened. Felicia Strand was the attending physician who had triaged Thomas Viard when he first presented to Hartwell General's emergency intake 14 days ago. She'd been on shift, she'd done the initial assessment. She'd been the one whose handwriting was on the paper intake form, the same paper intake form that showed an oxygen saturation reading 12% higher than what the digital record reflected, which meant the falsification had not been done by someone who came to the file after the fact. It had been done by the person who created the file. Strand had written the false number on the paper form and entered the false number into the digital record simultaneously. There was no gap between them, no alteration after the fact. The lie had been the original document. The paper form Lena had retrieved from the cabinet, the one she'd believed was the uncorrupted record, was itself the corruption. She sat with that for a long moment. "She referred him here," the analyst said, standing in the doorway with her tablet. "We went back through Viard's intake documentation. He didn't choose Hartwell General randomly. He was directed here by a physician at an urgent care clinic he visited 2 days before admission. That physician's practice has a referral relationship with Hartwell's internal medicine department." A pause. "Strand co-manages that referral relationship. She's been the receiving physician for 9 of the clinic's referred patients in the past year." "Viard was delivered to her," Lena said. "The clinic physician who referred him, a Dr. Orrin Massey, has financial ties to one of Mull's subcontracting companies. It's indirect. It took 3 layers of corporate structure to find it." The analyst hesitated. "We almost didn't look." Lena thought about that, about how close this had come to being a story that ended with a nurse's career destroyed, and a federal witness quietly removed from a timeline, and everyone above the line of direct action insulated by exactly the kind of layered structure that made accountability something that happened to other people. She picked up the page and brought it to Calloway. He read it standing up, which was how he processed serious information. He'd told her once, years ago, that sitting down made him feel like he was deciding something was settled before it was. He read it twice, the same way she had, and then he called the prosecutor's office. The call lasted 6 minutes. When he hung up, he said, "Strand is being brought in for questioning tonight, Massey as well. The referral chain is being added to the existing indictment structure." He set his phone on the table. "This doesn't delay what's already moving, it adds to it." "The paper form," Lena said, "the one I pulled from the cabinet, If she falsified it at intake, her handwriting is on it, Calloway said. Her signature at the bottom. Whatever she wrote, she wrote. The difference between what she wrote and what Viard's actual condition was on arrival is going to require a medical expert to testify about, someone who can look at the clinical picture and explain what the real numbers would have been. He looked at her steadily. We'd like that to be you. Lena looked at the table, at the case file spread across it, at the chain of decisions and documents and falsified numbers that had led from a clinic referral through an emergency intake through 14 days of managed deterioration to room 114 at 7 a.m. and the crash cart. And Thomas Viard's blue lips, and a nurse who'd taken a photograph because something in her gut said, document this. Yes, she said. The formal arraignment of Marcus Holt, Gareth Mull, and IT Administrator Kevin Prescott occurred 4 days later in federal court. Lena was not in the courtroom for it. She was in a different building across the city, sitting at a conference table with 2 members of the federal prosecutor's team and a forensic medical consultant named Dr. Asha Miran, walking through the clinical timeline of Thomas Viard's 14-day hospitalization with the same methodical precision she'd used with Ochoa in the field office. Except that this time, the conversation was being recorded for the formal case record, and everything she said would become part of the legal infrastructure of what happened next. She was careful. She was exact. She said what she knew and only what she knew, and when she didn't know something, she said so. And when the distinction between clinical observation and clinical interpretation mattered, she made the distinction clearly. It was the kind of testimony that wasn't dramatic in the moment. No theatrics, no confrontation, just a woman in a borrowed conference room describing in precise terms what had been done to a patient who had not been able to protect himself. Dr. Miran, across the table, asked, in your assessment, was there a point during Viard's hospitalization where appropriate clinical intervention could have altered the outcome? Lena thought about the question carefully before she answered it. Yes, she said, multiple points. The initial intake assessment significantly understated his presentation, which meant the monitoring protocol assigned to him was inadequate for his actual condition. If his real oxygenation level on admission had been properly recorded and addressed, he would have been placed on a higher acuity unit with continuous monitoring and a treatment plan that didn't include the medication regimen Dr. Holt ordered on day 2. The probability of a different outcome is, in my clinical opinion, substantial. How substantial? Miran asked. Lena looked at her. He should not have died in that hospital. Nobody at the table said anything for a moment. Then the recorder kept running, and they moved on. Felicia Strand was arrested on a Wednesday morning, 11 days after Viard's death. Lena found out through Calloway, a text message, just a time and a name, which was how he communicated things that were significant and complete. Strand had not gone quietly. Her attorney had filed 2 preemptive motions in the days between her interrogation and the arrest, both of which had been denied. She had made the calculation that her cooperation would earn her a better outcome than the cooperation she'd offered, which was correct as a strategy and insufficient as a reality, because the case against her was built on her own handwriting and her own digital logins and the referral chain that terminated at her desk. Orrin Massey, the clinic physician who had directed Viard to Hartwell, took a deal. His cooperation added 3 additional witnesses to the prosecutor's list and extended the financial fraud charges upward in ways that were still being documented when Lena left Raleigh 6 weeks after Viard died. She was not there for most of the legal aftermath. That was intentional, on her part and Calloway's. She had done what a witness and a consultant does, and the machinery of consequence was running without requiring her presence to keep it moving. There was something important in that, she thought. The thing that had been built didn't need her to hold it up anymore. It was standing on its own. The nursing board's review of Holt's complaint against her concluded in 22 days. The formal decision ran 4 pages. She read all of it. The finding was that the complaint had been filed in bad faith as part of a pattern of obstruction documented in the federal case record, that no evidence supported any finding of clinical negligence against Lena Hart, and that her license was confirmed in good standing with no mark on her record. The letter from Hartwell General's board of directors arrived the same week. It was longer and more formal than the nursing board's decision, full of the particular institutional language that organizations use when they are trying to convey accountability without using words that could be used against them in subsequent litigation. But underneath the language, the substance was clear. She had been wrongfully suspended, wrongfully accused, and wrongfully removed, and the hospital acknowledged it in writing. She read the letter at her kitchen table on Grayson Street, in the apartment she'd come back to after the events at the field office, which felt like a different space now. Not because anything in it had changed, but because she had been out of it at a high velocity for 36 hours, and returning to it had required a recalibration she hadn't expected. The framed photo that hadn't been on the shelf was still not on the shelf. She'd taken it when she packed. She put it back. It looked right where it had been. The reinstatement offer, senior clinical coordinator with a mandate to review patient record security protocols, she turned down on a Thursday afternoon, sitting at that same table with Calloway on the phone. "I knew you were going to turn it down," he said. "Then why did you let me take 2 weeks to think about it?" "Because you needed 2 weeks," he said. "Not to decide, to make sure." She applied for the federal patient safety liaison position the following morning. The application ran 17 pages, including the background disclosure section, which was, for someone with her service record, extensive. She completed it in 3 hours and submitted it before she could talk herself into revising it further. The sentencing phase of the federal case stretched across the following months. Lena was not required to be present for any of it, but Calloway kept her informed. Marcus Holt, medical license permanently revoked, pending criminal trial on charges including conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, and federal fraud. Bail denied on the basis of flight risk and the sustained pattern of evidence tampering documented in the case record. He would wait for trial in custody. His attorneys were excellent, and the trial would be long, and outcomes in complex federal cases were not certainties. But the man who had stood in room 114 with his jaw set and told Lena the entry was logged to her credentials was not practicing medicine, was not walking freely, and was not, by any assessment, winning. Gareth Mull, arrested, charged with conspiracy and federal fraud, and held on bail that his attorneys secured after 3 weeks of procedural maneuvering. But the asset freezes applied to his primary accounts meant that the contractor network he'd built was operationally paralyzed, and 3 of his subcontracting firms filed for dissolution in the weeks following his arrest. The bridges and the water treatment expansion he'd invoiced for materials that were never installed were placed under state engineering review. In 2 cases, construction was halted pending inspection. The thing he'd built, the actual physical thing, not just the financial structure, was being looked at in daylight for the first time. The state procurement official resigned his position and was under grand jury review. He issued a public statement through his attorney that contained no admission of wrongdoing and no specific facts. The statement was 7 sentences long and said nothing. It was, Lena thought when she read it, exactly the kind of nothing that a person produces when they have run out of more useful things to say. Felicia Strand lost her medical license pending criminal proceedings. She had been practicing medicine for 19 years. She had presumably, in those 19 years, done things that were the actual purpose of medicine, treated patients, helped people, used her training the way it was meant to be used. That history didn't disappear. But it also didn't balance against what she'd done to Thomas Viard, and Lena had stopped trying to find a framework in which it could. Kevin Prescott, cooperating witness, pled to 1 count of unauthorized computer access and 1 count of obstruction, both reduced from the original charges. He was sentenced to 14 months and ordered to perform 300 hours of community service upon release. His cooperation had been genuine in the end. It had also been self-interested in the beginning. Both things were true simultaneously, which was the nature of most human decisions made under the kind of pressure he'd been under, and Lena didn't have a simple feeling about it. She had a complicated one that she didn't try to resolve into something cleaner than it was. 7 weeks after the night in server room B, Calloway called her at 8 in the morning and said, "Your application was approved." She was standing in her kitchen making coffee. She set down the coffee pot. "When do I start?" she said. 4 weeks, he said. "Orientation in the regional office, then field assignment. You'll be reviewing multi-institutional systems in a 4-state corridor." I'm not your supervisor in this role. Different chain, but I'll be around. You'll always be around, she said. That's accurate, he said. She heard, in the pause that followed, something that in a different person might have been sentiment, and in Calloway was the compressed, pressurized version of it, the kind that doesn't expand into words because the words aren't the point. Calloway, she said. Yeah. Thank you for calling me. 14 months ago when you called about the VA oversight flag. And that night. A pause. Longer than his pauses usually were. You would have found it without me, he said. You already had the photograph. I wouldn't have known what it meant without the context you gave me. Maybe, he said, but you would have kept pulling on it. You wouldn't have been able to not pull on it. She thought about that, about whether it was a compliment or a statement of fact or just an accurate description of a characteristic she'd never quite decided how to feel about in herself. The inability to let a wrong number sit without understanding why it was wrong. I'll see you around, she said. Count on it, he said. The last time she walked into Hartwell General was on a Tuesday in early spring, 43 days after she'd walked out of it with a security officer at her side and 31 faces looking away. She was there in her official federal capacity, with credentials that were real and an appointment that the hospital's newly appointed interim administrator had agreed to with notable speed. The administrative review that had been initiated as part of the broader investigation had resulted in the replacement of 5 senior staff members and a board-level governance restructuring that was, by all accounts, still uncomfortable and ongoing. The hospital was not transformed. Institutions don't transform in 43 days. But it was different in the way that things are different when the specific structure that was protecting a specific wrongness has been removed, uncertain, somewhat exposed, having to hold itself up without the reinforcement it had been leaning on. She was there to begin the systemic review she'd described to Calloway that morning in the field office, the audit of record security protocols, the credential management practices, the anomaly detection gaps that had let a ghost account operate for months without triggering a flag. It would take weeks. She would be back multiple times. She badged in through the main entrance. The badge was federal, not hospital issued, and the security desk officer, not the same young man from before, a different shift, checked her credentials and logged her in without hesitation. She walked through the ER corridor. She didn't hurry. She didn't look for recognition. Didn't scan the faces she passed for evidence of what they knew or remembered or felt about what had happened in this building. She was here to do a specific job, and the job had nothing to do with how the people in these hallways felt about her. But Dara Shields was at the nurse's station. Dara looked up from the computer when Lena passed, and their eyes met, and what passed between them in that moment was too compressed to be called a conversation, and too specific to be called just a look. It was the acknowledgement of 2 people who had been on opposite ends of the same long night and who had both done something hard and who were both still here. Dara nodded. Lena nodded back. She kept walking. In the east stairwell, she passed a young nurse she didn't recognize, first year probably, the bearing of someone still adjusting to what the job actually felt like from the inside versus what they'd expected it to feel like. The nurse was holding a tablet and looking at something on it with the furrowed concentration of someone trying to reconcile 2 pieces of information that didn't match. Lena slowed. Is it not adding up? She said. The nurse looked up, startled. Sorry? The thing you're reading, Lena said. You've got that look. The nurse glanced at the tablet. The overnight vitals for one of my patients don't match what the day nurse charted at handoff. It's probably just a timing issue, but screenshot it, Lena said, right now before anything else. Then check the timestamps on both entries. The nurse blinked, then looked at the tablet, then took the screenshot. Why? The nurse asked. Because most of the time it's a timing issue, Lena said, and sometimes it isn't. And the only way you know the difference is if you documented it before someone else had a chance to make it look like a timing issue. The nurse looked at her, at the federal credentials on Lena's badge, back at her face. Okay, the nurse said. I'll check the timestamps. Good, Lena said. She went up the stairs. Boone was not a pet. He never had been. He was a working dog who happened to exist in her life during working hours and who had, over a year of active deployment and 14 months of her civilian life, become one of the most constant presences she'd had in either. Calloway had arranged for him to be assigned to her federal liaison work, part of a pilot program for MWD integration in non-combat federal roles, which was exactly the kind of bureaucratic framing that turned a dog and a person who had worked together in hard conditions into an approved operational unit. She found out about it the same day she found out about the job approval, and she had not said anything to Calloway about it because there wasn't anything to say that the arrangement itself hadn't already said. On the morning she started the systemic review at Hartwell General, Boone was in the federal vehicle in the parking lot with the window cracked, waiting. He would wait as long as she needed. He was good at waiting, in the way of things that are certain of their purpose and don't require constant confirmation of it. She thought about him while she set up in the conference room they'd assigned her, thought about the fact that his certainty of purpose had always been something she'd found stabilizing, not because she lacked her own, but because there's something about being around a creature that has no gap between what it is and what it does that makes the gap in humans more visible and somehow more manageable. She had spent a long time trying to have no gap, trying to be the ordinary nurse in the ordinary hospital with the ordinary life, and she had done it well enough that even she had sometimes almost believed it. And then Thomas Veard had come through the door of room 114, and the gap between what she was and what she was pretending to be had become the exact size of what was needed, and she had walked through it. Not because she'd wanted to, not because she'd had some clear vision of what it would cost or where it would lead. Because something in a chart hadn't matched, and she had a reflex, hardwired from years in conditions where a wrong number meant a person died, that would not let her leave a wrong number alone. That reflex had cost her a job, and her badge, and 2 days of the most sustained operational pressure she'd experienced since her discharge. It had also preserved a federal case, protected a witness, and put 4 people in the criminal justice system who would otherwise have continued doing what they'd been doing. She didn't know how to weigh those things against each other on a scale. She didn't think they went on a scale. What she knew was that she was sitting in a conference room in a hospital she'd spent 2 years trying to make herself invisible in, with federal credentials and a mandate that was exactly the shape of the thing she'd been trying to do in room 114 on the morning everything had changed. Look at the numbers, find the gaps, document the things that don't match before someone makes them match. Except now it was her job. She opened her laptop. She pulled up the hospital's credential management system under her federal access authority. She started at the beginning. The review was going to take weeks. Some of what she found was going to be uncomfortable for the people who ran this institution. Some of it was going to require changes that no institution makes easily because institutions are made of people, and people resist change in proportion to how much the existing structure has served them. It was not going to be clean. It was not going to be fast. It was going to be the work. And she knew how to do the work. There's a particular thing that happens to people who are underestimated long enough and consistently enough. They begin to carry the estimation. Not because they believe it, but because it's easier to move through the world quietly when the world has decided you're smaller than you are. You learn to store yourself in a compressed form. You learn to take up less space. What Lena Hart had learned across 2 years in a hospital and 3 years before that in places that required a different and more literal form of compression was that the stored form and the actual form were different things, and that the distance between them was not a failure. It was a reserve. Reserves exist for a reason. Thomas Veard had deserved a system that would catch what was being done to him. He had deserved nurses with the authority and the tools to act on what they noticed, instead of working inside a structure that protected the person doing the noticing against the person who'd been noticed. He hadn't gotten that, and she could not give it to him retroactively, could not go back to room 114 and change what the 48 hours before it had looked like. The thing she could do was build, in the hospital she would walk through in the months ahead, a version of that system that hadn't existed when he needed it. That was not a satisfying ending to his story. His story didn't have a satisfying ending. What it had was consequence, real, legal, documented, named, and a change in the structure of the place where it happened, and someone carrying the lesson forward into rooms he would never see. She worked through the morning. She made notes. She found 2 credential anomalies in the first 2 hours, neither of them as significant as the ghost account that had generated the entry in Veard's chart, but both of them the kind of thing that a well-designed system should have flagged and hadn't. She documented them with the same precision she'd used in every piece of this, the same precision she'd used when she was a combat medic writing field reports in conditions that were significantly less comfortable than this conference room. The same precision she'd used when she took a photograph of a wall-mounted tablet at 7:06 a.m. Because something didn't match, and she had learned, the hard way and in high-stakes conditions, never to leave a thing that didn't match undocumented. At 12:30, she took a break. She went to the parking lot. She opened the vehicle door and Boone jumped out and stood beside her in the mild spring air, and she let him spend 5 minutes being a dog in a parking lot, which he did with his full attention and complete satisfaction. She looked at the building. 43 days ago, she had walked out of it carrying her jacket and a small framed photo and the particular weight of someone who has just been publicly told that their understanding of what happened is wrong. She had not fallen apart on the sidewalk. She had put her earbuds in and figured out the bus route home. That was not resilience as a concept or a narrative. That was just what she did when there was a next step available, and falling apart wouldn't get her to it. There is always a next step, even when the institution has closed its doors, and the hallway is full of people who can't meet your eyes, and the badge has been handed in, and the evidence you know exists is temporarily inaccessible. There is always a next step, if you keep your hands steady and your eyes open and you document the things that don't match. She had kept her hands steady. She had taken the photograph. Everything else had followed from that. Boone pressed his head against her hand and looked up at her with the calm, complete attention of a dog that has never once found her wanting, and she held on to that for a moment. Not as comfort, not as sentiment, but as the thing it actually was, a true fact about where she stood. Then she went back inside. She had more numbers to check.